Don't come to my graduation. My stepdad is buying me a Mercedes and you can't compete. That's the text I got from my daughter, 3 days before she was to walk across the stage and get her college diploma. A diploma I had, though she didn't seem to remember it, largely paid for. I read it twice, standing in my kitchen, phone in my hand, on an ordinary Tuesday evening. My only child, 22 years old, telling her own father not to come to her graduation, one of the most important days of her life, a day I had been looking forward to for 4 years, a day I had, in some quiet corner of my heart, been looking forward to since the moment they placed her in my arms, because a man with a checkbook had told her he'd buy her a Mercedes, and I, apparently, couldn't compete. Couldn't compete. As though her graduation were an auction, as though a father's presence on the day his child becomes an adult were a lot to be won by the highest bidder, as though the whole of my relationship with my daughter came down to a bidding war over a German automobile, and I had been outbid and was therefore excused from attending. And I want to tell you what I felt standing there, because it wasn't rage, though I think rage might have been easier. What I felt was a grief so deep and so old that it had almost become a part of my furniture, a grief I'd been carrying for years, that this text simply brought roaring back to the surface. Because this text was not really about a car. This text was the final, clearest result of a campaign that had been waged against me, patiently and expensively, for over a decade. A campaign to buy my daughter away from me, to make her ashamed of me, to reduce me in her eyes to a man who couldn't compete. And it had worked. That's the thing I had to sit with, standing in my kitchen. It had worked. My little girl, who used to fall asleep on my chest, who used to call me at college in her first homesick weeks, who I had loved every single day of her life without a single day's interruption. My little girl had just told me I wasn't worth showing up for, because someone else's money was shinier than mine. And I want to tell you exactly what I texted back, because it is the whole hinge of this story, and it is the thing I am proudest of in all of it. I texted back, "Congrats, enjoy the car, I love you, and I'll always be here." That's it. No argument, no guilt trip, no listing of everything I'd done for her, everything I'd paid for, every way I'd been there when the man with the checkbook was nowhere to be found. No trying to compete. Because the moment you compete for your child's love with money, you've already lost something far more important than the competition. You've agreed that love is a thing that can be bought, and it can't, and I was not going to be the second person in her life to teach her that it could. So I said, "Congratulations," and I told her to enjoy the car, and I told her I loved her, and I put my phone down, and I did not go to my daughter's graduation. And 10 minutes after she got my reply, 10 minutes, something happened on the other side of that story, in the world of the man who was buying her the Mercedes, that would eventually bring his entire carefully constructed illusion crashing down. Because there was something that man did not know. Something about who I actually was, and what I actually owned, and the ground he was standing on that he thought was so solid. He had spent a decade making sure my daughter saw me as a man who couldn't compete, and he had no idea, none, what I could actually do, or that the world he was so proud of, the world he was using to buy my child, was more connected to me than he could possibly have imagined. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and none of this means what it needs to mean unless I tell it in order, because you need to understand how a father gets to the point of being told not to come to his own daughter's graduation, and who the man buying the Mercedes really was, and how the whole thing came apart. And I promise you, it is not what you think, and the most important part of it has nothing to do with money at all. So stay with me. And if you have ever been made to feel like you couldn't compete for the love of your own child, like someone with more money or more charm or more time was quietly buying away a person who was supposed to be yours, reach down and hit that subscribe button right now. Because this is a story about a father who was told he couldn't compete, and about what happened when the competition turned out to be measuring the wrong thing entirely. Let me back up. My name is Sterling Vance. I'm 61 years old now, and all of this came to a head last year, when I was 60 and my daughter graduated, and I've had a year to sit with it and to see how it all turned out, and I'm going to tell it to you straight, including the parts where I made mistakes, because a father doesn't lose this much ground with his child without having stumbled somewhere himself. Let me tell you who I am, because the man buying my daughter a Mercedes made a very expensive mistake in never bothering to find out. I grew up with nothing. I've told that story 100 times, and it's still true. A poor kid, a rough start, the kind of childhood that either breaks you or forges you, and it forged me. I had a gift for building things, businesses specifically. I could see an opportunity where other people saw a problem, and I had the appetite to work harder than anyone else in the room, and over about 35 years I built that gift into a considerable fortune. I'm going to be plain about it, because it matters to the story. I'm a wealthy man. Quietly wealthy, that's an important distinction, and it's the whole engine of what happened. I don't drive flashy cars. I don't wear my money. I built a holding company over the decades, a company that quietly owns other companies, a whole portfolio of them across a lot of industries. Car dealerships, real estate, retail, service businesses. I own pieces of an enormous number of ordinary-looking enterprises, and most people who deal with those businesses have no idea that a soft-spoken man named Sterling Vance is the person the money ultimately flows up to. I built it quietly on purpose, because I learned young that loud money attracts the wrong kind of people, the flatterers, the users, the ones who love you for your checkbook. And quiet money lets you see people as they really are. I wanted to know who liked me for me, so I never flashed it. I lived well, but not showily. And that decision, that lifelong habit of keeping my wealth quiet, is the exact thing that let a much smaller, much louder man convince my daughter that I couldn't compete. Because he had no idea, and neither did she, what I actually had, or what I could actually do. I learned that lesson early, and I learned it the hard way, and it's worth telling you how, because it explains everything about the choices I made with Ren. When I first started making real money, in my 30s, I did the thing everyone does at first. I enjoyed it out loud. Nicer car, nicer watch, picking up every check, letting people see. And within about 2 years, I was surrounded by people who adored me, and I slowly realized that not one of them would have crossed the street for the man I'd been before the money. They loved the checkbook. And the day I tested it, the day I pretended to a couple of these friends that I'd hit a rough patch and needed help, they evaporated like morning fog. Every one of them. And it taught me the single most important thing I know about human beings. Money attracts people who love money, and it disguises them as people who love you. The only way to know who actually loves you is to not show them the money and see who stays. So I went quiet permanently. I made my fortune invisible. And the people who stayed in my quiet life were the real ones. It was the best decision I ever made, and it's the exact decision that decades later let Prescott convince my own daughter I was a nobody. The armor that protected me from false friends also hid me from my own child. I've thought a great deal about that irony. I still think I made the right choice. But it cost me, and I want to be honest that it cost me. But I want to say the most important thing first, before you get the wrong idea about what kind of story this is. None of that, none of the money, none of the holding company, none of what I could do is the point. I would have given every dollar of it gladly, joyfully, to have simply not gotten that text, to have had a daughter who wanted me at her graduation. The money is the mechanism of this story, but it is not the heart of it, and I need you to hold on to that, because I refuse to be a man who thinks his wealth is the most valuable thing about him. It isn't. The most valuable thing I ever had was a little girl who used to fall asleep on my chest, and no holding company on earth could replace her. Let me give you one picture of her from before all this, so you understand what was at stake. When Ren was little, 5, 6 years old, she had a ritual. Every night I'd come home, often late, often exhausted, and no matter how tired she was supposed to be, she'd have fought sleep to wait up for me, and she'd hear the door and come barreling down the hall in her pajamas yelling, "Daddy's home!" And she'd launch herself at me, and I'd catch her every time, and she'd wrap herself around me like a little koala and put her face in my neck. And we had this thing we said. I'd say, "How much do I love you?" And she'd throw her arms out as wide as they'd go and say, "This much." And I'd say, "More than that." And she'd say, "More than that." And I'd say, more than all the money in the world. And she'd giggle because to a 5-year-old that was the most money there could possibly be. More than all the money in the world. I said it to her 1,000 times when she was small, and I meant it with everything I had. And the terrible irony that I would sit with years later is that a man with actual money in the world spent a decade convincing her that money in the world was exactly what love was measured in. He took the thing I'd taught her was infinite, love that's bigger than all the money there is, and he put a price tag on it. A Mercedes-sized price tag. And for a while, she believed him. That's what I lost. Not a daughter to another man's affection, a daughter to another man's accounting. Let me tell you how I lost her, or how I nearly did, because you can't understand that graduation text without the decade behind it. Let me tell you about my ex-wife, Camille, and I'm going to try very hard to be fair, because bitterness makes the story small, and I want to tell this one truly. Camille and I married young, and for a while we were happy, or I thought we were, and we had Ren, my daughter, my only child, the great love of my life, and for the first 10 years or so we were a family. And then things came apart, the way they do, and I won't air all of it because it's private and because Ren might someday hear this. But the marriage ended, and it ended hard, and Camille and I divorced when Ren was about 11 years old. And here's the first mistake I'll own, because I promised you honesty. In the divorce, and in the years right after, I threw myself into work. I did it partly to cope. Building things was how I'd always survived pain, and partly because I told myself I was securing Ren's future, providing for her, being a good father in the way I knew how, which was to make money and make sure she'd never want for anything. And in doing that, I was less present than I should have been in those crucial years. I was there, I never missed a support payment, I saw her on my scheduled time, I paid for everything. But I was often distracted, often working, often loving her through provision rather than presence. And that gap, that little gap between the father I was and the father I should have been, was the opening that another man walked through. I want to be even more honest about this because I think there are fathers watching who need to hear it, and because I earned the right to say it by living it. After the divorce, I did the thing that so many men of my generation do, and that so many of us have to live to regret. I equated providing with parenting. I thought that because I was paying for everything, the house Ren lived in, the school, the clothes, the vacations, all of it, I was being a good father. I thought the checks were love. And I threw myself into work partly because work was where I felt competent, and home was where I felt the loss, and it was easier to close a deal than to sit in the ache of a broken family. And here is the hard truth. A child does not experience your provision as love. A child experiences your presence as love. Ren didn't feel loved because I paid her tuition. She felt loved when I was there. And in those years right after the divorce, when she was 11, 12, 13, and needed her father present more than ever, I was too often absent. Physically there on my scheduled weekends, but mentally somewhere else. Tired, distracted, building the fortune I told myself was for her. I gave her the Sunday and forgot to sit down and eat it with her. And that absence, that specific parental failure, is the door Prescott walked through. He couldn't have bought her if I'd been fully present. My absence created the vacancy his money filled. I have forgiven myself for it, mostly because I was in pain and doing my best. But I will not pretend it wasn't my failure, because it was, and pretending otherwise would let another father watching make the same mistake. Because a couple of years after the divorce, Camille remarried, and the man she married is the man buying the Mercedes, and his name is Prescott Dahl. Let me tell you about Prescott, and I'm going to be as fair as I can, which I'll admit is a struggle. Prescott Dahl is a striver. He is a man consumed, utterly consumed, by status and appearance and the impression he makes. He does reasonably well. He's got a good income, a nice house, the trappings. But here is the thing about Prescott that took me years to understand. It's never enough for him. And more than that, his sense of himself depends entirely on being seen to win. Prescott doesn't want things because he enjoys them. He wants them because he wants to be seen having them and beating other people to them. He is the kind of man who needs to be the richest guy at the barbecue, the man with the best car in the parking lot, the winner of every comparison. Because without winning the comparison, he doesn't quite know who he is. And when Prescott married Camille and became Wren's stepfather, he found, in my daughter, a new arena to compete in. And the man he decided to compete against was me. I don't think Prescott ever cared about Wren the way a father cares about a child. Not at first, anyway, and maybe not ever, though I'll be fair and say people can grow. What Prescott cared about from the beginning was winning. Winning Wren's affection away from her real father. Being the better dad, not through love, which he didn't have in surplus, but through the only currency he understood: money. And so, from the time Wren was a young teenager, Prescott set about, systematically and expensively, buying my daughter. It started small and it escalated for years. He'd take her on trips I couldn't match. Not because I couldn't afford them, remember, but because I didn't believe in buying a child's love, so I didn't try to compete, which of course made it look like I couldn't. He'd buy her expensive gifts and make sure she knew how expensive they were. He'd casually mention in front of her the things he could provide that some people couldn't. And slowly, drip by drip, dollar by dollar, he built up in my daughter's teenage mind a picture. Prescott is the one with money. Prescott is the one who provides the exciting things. Prescott is the winner. And Dad is the guy who doesn't take me anywhere nice, who doesn't buy me the big gifts, who can't compete. And this is my second mistake, and it's a big one. I let it happen. Out of a kind of pride, honestly. I was so determined not to buy her love, so certain that real love couldn't be purchased, and that she'd see through Prescott eventually, that I refused to play his game at all. And I underestimated how a teenager's mind works, how a child measures love in the concrete things she can see, how a relentless, decade-long campaign of expensive gestures can genuinely reshape how a young person sees two men. I thought my quiet, steady love would speak for itself. It didn't speak loudly enough. Prescott's money shouted, and my love whispered, and a teenager heard the shouting. There was one moment, when Wren was about 16, that I think about more than almost any other, because it's the moment I understood exactly what I was up against and made, I now believe, the wrong call. It was her birthday. I'd planned something quiet and meaningful. I'd tracked down and restored a first edition of the book she'd loved most as a child, the one I used to read her to sleep with, and I'd written a long letter inside the cover about what she meant to me. It had taken me months to find, and it was, to me, worth more than anything with a price tag. And I gave it to her, and she was politely pleased. And then Prescott gave her his gift, which was the latest, most expensive phone, top of the line, and a pair of designer shoes she'd been wanting, and I watched my daughter's face light up in a way it had not lit up for my carefully restored book. And I watched her hug Prescott with real excitement, and I understood, standing there, that I was losing, and that the reason I was losing was that a 16-year-old cannot yet understand why a restored childhood book is worth more than a new phone. That's not a moral failing in a 16-year-old. It's just where a 16-year-old is developmentally. But it broke something in me to see it. And here's my mistake. That was the moment I should have doubled down on presents. Not on gifts. I was right about that, but on showing up, on being relentlessly there in the ways that would matter when she was older. Instead, wounded, I pulled back a little, protected myself a little, told myself she'd understand someday and I'd just wait for someday. I let the hurt make me a little more absent, exactly when I should have made myself more present. The book was right. The retreat was wrong. I've had to make my peace with both. Now, I want to tell you about the years leading up to that graduation, because they were painful and they set the stage. As Wren went through high school and then off to college, the gap widened. Prescott escalated. And Wren, who was becoming an adult in a world where one father showered her with expensive things and the other seemed comparatively plain, drifted further and further toward Prescott and away from me. Not because Prescott loved her more, he didn't, I'm certain of that, but because Prescott had successfully framed the entire relationship as a competition of provision, and in a competition of visible provision, I was losing, because I refused to compete. I paid for her college, by the way, fully. Prescott made a big show of offering to help, but it was I who quietly wrote the checks for her tuition, her housing, her expenses, because that's what a father does and because I didn't need credit for it. Which meant, in one of the great bitter ironies of this whole thing, that I was the one actually funding my daughter's life, while Prescott got the credit for being the generous, exciting, winning father figure by buying flashy extras on top of the foundation I was quietly providing. He bought the cherry, I bought the entire sundae, and everyone thanked him for dessert. And I said nothing. Because the moment you start keeping score out loud with your own child, the moment you say, "Actually, I pay for everything," he just buys you trinkets, you've turned your love into an argument, and you've made your child into a referee, and I would not do that to Wren. So I stayed quiet, and I kept paying, and I kept loving her, and I watched a man with a checkbook and a bottomless need to win slowly convince my daughter that I didn't matter. Which brings us to the Mercedes, and the graduation, and the text. As Wren's college graduation approached, Prescott, I later learned, had decided to make his grandest gesture yet, the ultimate winning move. He was going to buy her a brand new Mercedes as a graduation gift, a genuinely expensive car, a showstopper, and present it at her graduation in front of everyone, the definitive proof that he was the father who could provide, the winner of the decade-long competition he'd been running in his own head. And apparently, in the lead-up, Wren had absorbed the framing so completely that she genuinely believed her graduation had become a kind of contest between her two father figures, and that Prescott, with his Mercedes, had won it. And so she sent me that text. "Don't come to my graduation. My stepdad is buying me a Mercedes and you can't compete." She wasn't even trying to be cruel, I don't think. That's almost the worst part. In her mind, she was just stating the obvious result of a competition that had been running her whole adolescence. Prescott had won. I'd lost. Losers don't come to the ceremony. It was just math to her. Prescott's math. The math he'd spent a decade and a fortune teaching her. And I texted back, "Congrats, enjoy the car, I love you, and I'll always be here," and I put down my phone. Now, here is the part where I have to be very honest and very careful, because this is exactly where a story like this goes wrong, and I refuse to let it. I did not, in that moment, decide to use my money and my power to hurt my daughter. I want to be as clear as I have ever been about anything. Wren is my child. She was, at that moment, a confused 22-year-old who had been manipulated for a decade by a man exploiting a teenager's inability to tell the difference between love and money. She was not my enemy. She was the victim of this whole thing, even as she was hurting me. And there is no version of this story where a father uses his wealth to punish or sabotage or teach a brutal lesson to his own confused child, and I need you to know that I never for 1 second considered it. A father protects his kid, even when his kid is breaking his heart, especially then. So, what happened 10 minutes later? What was the thing that started to bring Prescott's illusion down? It wasn't something I did to Wren. It was something that was simply always true, a fact about the world that Prescott, in his decade of strutting, had never bothered to discover, and that was about to walk up and introduce itself to him. Let me explain. Remember what I told you about my holding company, that it quietly owns a whole portfolio of ordinary businesses across many industries, including car dealerships? Well, here is a fact that Prescott Dahl did not know, because Prescott, like my daughter, had spent a decade so certain that I was a man who couldn't compete that he never once bothered to find out what I actually did or what I actually owned. The Mercedes dealership where Prescott was buying that car, the specific dealership in our area where he had gone to make his grand winning gesture, was one of the businesses owned, ultimately, through a chain of holdings, by my company. By me. I want to be careful here, because I know how this sounds, and I know where these stories go, and I promise you I did not do the cartoonish thing. I did not call the dealership and cancel my daughter's car out of spite. I would never take a car away from my own child, and more importantly, doing something like that would have been petty and cruel, and exactly the kind of using money as a weapon that I had spent my whole life refusing to do. That is not what happened. Please hold on and let me tell you what actually happened, because it's better, and it's grounded, and it's true to who I am. What happened is this. The general manager of that dealership is a woman I've known and worked with for years, a sharp, decent person named Ngozi Achebe, who runs that location for me and knows exactly who I am, because she reports up through my company. Ngozi and I talk regularly, and it so happened, this is the 10 minutes later, that on the very evening all this was unfolding, Ngozi called me about an unrelated business matter, a routine check-in about the dealership's quarter. And in the course of that call, making conversation, Ngozi mentioned, with some amusement, that they had a whale of a customer in the showroom that week. A man buying a top-of-the-line Mercedes as a graduation gift for his stepdaughter, and making an enormous production of it, throwing his weight around, name-dropping, demanding VIP treatment, being, in Ngozi's words, a lot. A man named Prescott Dahl. And I went very quiet on the phone, because I realized in that moment that my daughter's graduation Mercedes, the car that had been declared the winning move in the competition for her soul, the car her stepfather was using to tell her I couldn't compete, was being purchased at that very moment from a dealership that I owned. That the man buying my daughter's love with the Mercedes was, without having the faintest idea, buying it from me. That Prescott Dahl, in his grand gesture to prove he'd beaten Sterling Vance, was handing his money to a business that belonged to Sterling Vance. The universe, it turns out, has a sense of humor. And I want to tell you honestly about the temptation of that moment, because I'd be lying if I said there wasn't one. For about 30 seconds, sitting there on the phone with Ngozi, a whole dark little fantasy unspooled in front of me. I could do anything I wanted with this. I could have the deal fall through. I could have Prescott quietly humiliated at the dealership he was strutting around. I could let him complete the purchase and then, at some perfect dramatic moment, reveal to everyone that the great winning gesture had been financed into my pocket. I had, in that instant, total power over the proudest moment of a man who'd spent a decade grinding my daughter's love away from me. And every human instinct for revenge lit up at once. And then I thought about Ren. And the fantasy died instantly, because every version of it ran through her. Any move I made against Prescott at that dealership would land on her graduation, on her gift, on her day. There was no way to hurt Prescott in that moment without hurting my daughter, and the second I saw that clearly, there was no decision left to make. You do not get to take revenge on a man through a child you love. The child is not a weapon, and she is not collateral. That's the line, and I have never once been tempted to cross it where it actually counted, no matter how much I wanted to strangle Prescott Dahl in that showroom. 30 seconds of fantasy, and then I let it go, because I'm her father, and her father's job is to protect her even from my own anger. And I want to tell you what I did with that information, because it is the entire moral of this story, and it is the thing that separates me from Prescott. I did nothing cruel with it. Nothing. Let me tell you what I actually did over the following weeks and months, because it's quieter and better than what you might expect, and it's the part I'm actually proud of. But first, let me tell you what I did not do, because the restraint is the point. I did not cancel the car. Ren got her Mercedes, exactly as planned. I made sure of it, actually. I quietly told Ngozi to make sure the transaction went perfectly smoothly, that my daughter got a flawless car and a wonderful experience, because whatever was going on between the adults, that was my little girl getting her graduation present, and I wanted it to be right for her. Prescott never knew that the seamless VIP experience he was so proud of receiving was being ensured by the very man he was trying to beat. I even did one more small thing that I've never told anyone until now. When the car was delivered, I quietly arranged, through Ngozi, for it to come with every possible protection paid for and quietly upgraded, the best warranty, the full service package, everything that would keep my daughter safe and unbothered on the road for years, all of it silently covered on my end, and folded invisibly into the deal. Prescott thought he was buying my daughter a car. I made sure my daughter was actually protected in it, for years to come, without either of them ever knowing I'd had a hand in it. Because that's the difference between us that I keep coming back to. Prescott wanted the credit for the gesture, and I wanted my daughter to be safe. He bought the appearance of caring for her. I quietly did the actual caring, underneath, where no one would ever see it or thank me for it. That's the whole thing, really, in one small hidden act. One of us was performing love and one of us was doing it, and the performance was the one that got applauded at the graduation. I did not go to the graduation and make a scene. I respected Ren's wishes and stayed away, though it broke my heart, because forcing myself into her day against her stated wishes would have been about my needs, not hers. I did not expose Prescott to Wren in a dramatic confrontation. I did not call her and say, "You know that dealership is mine. You know I pay for your whole life while he buys trinkets," because that would have been me competing, finally, playing Prescott's game, turning my daughter into a referee. And I would not do it. What I did instead was simply continue to be who I was, and let time and truth do the work that no dramatic gesture could. So let me tell you how it actually came apart for Prescott, because it did, and it came apart the way these things really do, not with a single explosive reveal, but through the slow exposure of what he actually was. Here's the thing about a man like Prescott, a man whose entire self is built on winning and appearing to win. That kind of structure is brittle. It looks impressive, and it cannot survive contact with reality. And over the months following that graduation, reality came for Prescott in a few different ways, none of which I engineered, all of which flowed naturally from who he was. The first thing was the car itself, ironically. Because it turned out that Prescott had somewhat overextended himself with that grand gesture, the Mercedes was a genuine financial stretch for him. A stretch he made not because he could comfortably afford it, but because he needed the win so badly. And a striver who stretches to buy a status symbol he can't quite afford is a man walking on thin ice, and Prescott had been doing versions of that for years, buying wins on credit, financially and otherwise. His whole glittering picture, I came to understand, was more leveraged and less solid than it appeared, much like his relationship with my daughter. The second thing was that, as Wren grew into a fuller adulthood, as she got out of school and into the actual working world and started to develop real judgment, she began, slowly, to see Prescott more clearly. This is the thing Prescott never understood. You can buy a teenager's dazzled affection, but a maturing adult starts to notice things. She started to notice that Prescott's love always came with a bill attached, emotionally, that his gifts were always a little bit about him, that he needed her gratitude, needed her to perform being impressed, in a way that started to feel less like love and more like a transaction. She started to notice that the stepfather who'd won was strangely fragile, strangely needy, strangely dependent on her validation. And she started to remember, I think, some things about her real father. The man who'd quietly paid for everything without making a show of it. The man who'd said, "Congrats, enjoy the car, I love you, and I'll always be here," with no bitterness, no scorekeeping, no demand, on the day she told him not to come to her graduation. That text, it turned out, landed differently in her memory as she got older. At 22, in the moment, it had seemed like a loser conceding. But as she matured, she started to wonder what kind of man responds to that much cruelty with that much grace. What kind of man loves you enough to let you hurt him and still tells you he'll always be there? That is not, she began to realize, the behavior of a man who couldn't compete. That is the behavior of a man who was operating on a completely different level, a level that had nothing to do with money, a level Prescott couldn't even see. Now, I have to tell you about the reveal, the moment it all crystallized, because there was one, eventually, and it involved that dealership, and it's the closest thing this story has to Prescott's face going white. It happened about 8 months after the graduation. Wren had, by then, started to reconnect with me, cautiously, a little at a time, a coffee here, a phone call there, the beginnings of her finding her way back. And in the course of one of those conversations, she was telling me, not knowing, still, what I owned, about the whole graduation car saga, and she mentioned the dealership by name, complaining a little about how Prescott had behaved there, how embarrassing he'd been, throwing his weight around. And I made a decision, in that moment, that I hadn't made before, because the time was finally right. I didn't do it to win. I did it because my daughter was becoming a woman who could handle the truth, and because the truth, gently told, might help free her from a decade of Prescott's framing. I said, "Wren, I need to tell you something, and I want you to know I've never told you before, because I didn't want it to be a weapon. That dealership, the one where Prescott bought your car, I own it. It's part of my company. Your graduation Mercedes was bought without Prescott having any idea from a business that belongs to me." And I watched my daughter's face. And it wasn't about the car or the money in the end. What I watched happen on my daughter's face was the slow collapse of a decade-long illusion. Because in that instant she understood the whole architecture of the lie she'd been living inside. She understood that the man who'd spent her whole adolescence positioning himself as the wealthy winner, the one with the money, the one her plain old dad couldn't compete with, that man had, in his grandest moment of supposed victory, been unknowingly handing his money to her father. That her father hadn't been unable to compete. Her father had owned the arena the whole time and had simply refused to turn his love for her into a competition. And she understood, all at once, what that meant about the two men. That Prescott, who had the smaller everything, had spent a decade desperately performing wealth and winning, because performing was all he had, and that her real father, who had more than Prescott could dream of, had spent that same decade refusing to perform any of it, because he loved her too much to make her love a thing that could be bought. One man used money because it was all he had. The other man refused to use money because he had something better. "You could have told me," she finally said, and her voice was breaking. "All those years. You could have shown me. You could have bought me things, competed, told me what he really was, told me you owned half the... You could have won. Why didn't you?" And I told her the truth. I said, "Because the second I competed for you with money, I'd have been telling you that you're the kind of thing that can be bought. And you're not. You're my daughter, and my love for you was never for sale, and I wasn't going to be the man who taught you it was. He was already doing that. I wasn't going to help him." And my daughter came around the table and put her arms around me and cried, and I held my little girl for the first time in years, the little girl who used to fall asleep on my chest. And I want to tell you that no business I have ever built, no deal I have ever closed, no dollar I have ever earned, has ever felt like that moment felt. "And here's the thing," she said, into my shoulder, "that I'll carry to my grave." She said, "How much do you love me?" Our old question, the one from when she was 5, that I hadn't heard in 15 years, that I didn't even know she remembered. And my voice didn't work for a second. And then I managed it. I said, "More than that." And she pulled back and looked at me with her wet face and threw her arms out as wide as they'd go, the way she did when she was little. And she said, "More than all the money in the world?" And I said, "More than all the money in the world, I always did, I always will." And we both fell apart because we both knew, in that moment, that the money in the world had been the whole weapon used against us, and that it had lost, that the infinite thing I'd promised her when she was 5 had turned out to be real and bigger than any car, and that she'd finally come home to it. Now, the honest rest of it, because these stories always want to end at the tearful embrace, and life is longer and more complicated than that. Ren and I are rebuilding, and it's real, and it's the great joy of my later years, but I won't pretend it was instant or that a decade of drift healed in one conversation. It took time, it's still taking time. But she's back in my life, genuinely, and she calls me now not because I have money, but because she finally understands who her father actually is, and that is worth more than everything else combined. Her relationship with Prescott, meanwhile, cooled considerably, not because I poisoned it, I want to stress. I never said a bad word about him to her, but because once she started seeing clearly, she couldn't unsee. The gifts stopped landing the way they used to. The performances started to look like performances, and Prescott, who had built his entire relationship with her on being the winning provider, found that he had nothing else to offer once she stopped being dazzled by the provision. A relationship built entirely on money has nothing left when the money stops impressing. He'd never built anything real with her, because he'd never understood that real was an option. So when the illusion faded, there was nothing underneath. I even feel a strange, distant pity for Prescott now, if I'm honest. Because here is a man who spent a decade and a small fortune trying to win a competition that existed only in his own head, against an opponent who was never even playing for a prize, my daughter's love, that he could never actually win by the only means he understood. He mistook the whole nature of the thing. He thought love was a competition of provision, and he won that competition, and discovered that winning it got him nothing, because it was the wrong competition. Ren didn't come back to me because I revealed I was richer. She came back because I was the one who'd loved her without a price tag. Prescott never had that to give, and all the Mercedes in the world couldn't manufacture it. Camille and Prescott, I hear, are having their own difficulties, and I take no pleasure in it, and it's none of my business. And Wren has her Mercedes still, and drives it, and I'm glad. It's a nice car, and my granddaughter someday will ride in it. And the fact that it came, in a roundabout cosmic joke, from a dealership I own, is a private irony that Wren and I now share and occasionally laugh about. She offered, once, half joking, to give it back given where it came from, and I told her don't be ridiculous. Keep the car, drive it in good health, just remember which of your fathers actually loved you and which one was buying a trophy. Here's the thing I keep coming back to, and then I'll let you go. My daughter told me I couldn't compete, and the deepest truth of this whole story is that she was right. I couldn't compete, and I wouldn't. And that refusal is the entire reason I eventually got her back. Because Prescott and I were never actually competing for the same thing, and we were never using the same currency. Prescott was competing to be the most impressive, the most generous-looking, the winner of a visible contest of provision, and in that contest, measured that way, he won. He had the grand gestures. He had the Mercedes at the graduation. He was, by his own scorekeeping, the champion. But I wasn't competing for that at all. I was just loving my daughter. Steadily, quietly, without condition, without keeping score, without a price tag, through years of being made to look like the loser. I wasn't trying to win her. You can't win a person. You can only love them and hope they eventually see it, and be there, always be there, for when they do. And that's the thing I'd want you to take from this, if you take anything. If someone is trying to make you compete for the love of your own child, with money, with gifts, with grand gestures, do not take the bait. You cannot win a bidding war for a human heart, and the moment you enter one, you've already lost the most important thing, which is the truth that love isn't a thing that's bought. Refuse to compete. Love steadily and quietly and without condition, and be there, and trust that a child who is being bought will eventually grow into an adult who can tell the difference between a person who loved her and a person who purchased her. It may take years. It took me years. But love that asks for nothing is the only kind that lasts, and the flashy, transactional, buying kind of love collapses the moment the buyer runs out of things to buy or the child runs out of reasons to be impressed. And if you're a father or a mother in the middle of this right now, if there's a well-funded someone buying your child's affection out from under you, and you feel that awful helpless burn of watching money outbid your love, I want to say one more thing directly to you, because I lived in that place for a decade, and I know how it feels. It feels like you're losing. It feels like you have to do something, match them, fight back, prove yourself, or you'll lose your child forever. And I am here, on the other side of it, to tell you, hold the line. Do not become the thing you're fighting. The parent who starts buying back their child's love has simply agreed that love is for sale, and then the child has two vendors instead of one parent. Your quiet, unpurchased, present love is not losing, even when it looks like it's losing. It is the only thing in the whole contest that's real, and reality has a way of outlasting performance. Be present, be steady, ask for nothing, and wait for your child to grow into someone who can finally tell the gold from the glitter. Most of them do. Mine did. I nearly gave up 100 times, and I'm so glad I didn't because the daughter I have back now is worth every year of the wait. I couldn't compete. Thank God I couldn't. Because if I'd been the kind of man who could compete, who'd match Prescott gift for gift, who'd buy my daughter's affection right back, I'd have just been a second Prescott, and she'd have grown up with two men treating her love as a purchasable commodity, and she might never have learned that it wasn't. Instead, she had one man who bought her and one man who loved her, and given enough time she could tell the difference. That difference is the whole story. That difference brought her home. So let me ask you something, and I do read these. Have you ever refused to compete for someone's love with money or gifts? Refused to turn your relationship into a bidding war, even when it made you look like you were losing? What happened? I'd truly like to know, because I've learned that the refusal to compete is one of the hardest and most important things a loving person can do, and I suspect some of you have had to hold that line too. And here's the one that matters most to me, and I ask it gently, Is there a young person in your life right now who's being dazzled by someone's money or grand gestures and drifting away from the quieter people who actually love them? Don't fight the money. You can't win that fight and you shouldn't try. Just keep loving them, steadily, without condition, and be there, always be there, for when they grow up enough to see clearly. Because they will, more often than you'd think. My Wren did. Tell me about the young person you're waiting for below, and I'll be rooting for you. That's all I've got tonight. If it meant something to you, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you at the next one.